Good morning. Today is October 18th. I forgot my eyebrows. Anyway, let's get started. Figure 30 shows the federal funds rate, the short-term interest rate that is a normal tool the Fed uses for monetary policy. You can see that at the end of Chairman Greenspan's term and the beginning of my term in 2006, we were in the process of raising the federal funds rate in an attempt to normalize monetary policy after having easier policy earlier in the decade in order to help the economy recover from the 2001 recession. But in 2007, as problems begin to appear in the subprime mortgage market, the Fed began to cut interest rates. You can see on the right side of the graph that interest rates were sharply reduced, and by December 2008, the federal funds rate was reduced to a range of between 0 and 25 basis points. A basis point is 1/100th of 1%, so 25 basis points means 1/4 of 1%. By December 2008, the federal funds rate was reduced basically to 0. It cannot be cut anymore, obviously. So as of December 2008, conventional monetary policy was exhausted. We could not cut the federal funds rate any further, and yet the economy clearly needed additional support. Into 2009, the economy was still contracting at a rapid rate. We needed something else to support recovery, and so we turned to less conventional monetary policy. The main tool we have used is what we in the Fed call the large-scale asset purchases, or LSAPs, known as in the press and elsewhere as quantitative easing, or QE. These large-scale asset purchases were an alternative way of easing monetary policy to provide support to the economy. So how does this work? To influence long-term rates, the Fed began to undertake large-scale purchases of Treasury and GSE mortgage-related securities. So just to be clear here, the securities that the Fed has been purchasing are government-guaranteed securities, either Treasury securities, that is government debt of the United States, or Fannie and Freddie securities, which were guaranteed by the US government after Fannie and Freddie were taken into conservatorship. There have been two major rounds of large-scale asset purchases, one announced in March 2009, often known as QE1, and another announced in November 2010, known as QE2. There have been some additional variations since then, including a program to lengthen the maturity of our existing assets, but these were the two biggest programs in terms of their size and their impact on the Fed balance sheet. Taken together, these actions increased the Fed balance sheet by more than $2 trillion. Figure 31 shows the asset side of the Fed balance sheet to help us see the effects of the large-scale asset purchases. The bottom layer is the traditional securities holdings. To be absolutely clear, even under normal circumstances, the Fed always owns a substantial amount of the US Treasuries. We owned more than $800 billion worth of US Treasuries before the crisis began. It is not as though we began buying them from scratch. We It is not as though we began buying them from scratch. We have always owned a significant amount of these securities, so the bottom layer shows the baseline from which we started. Other assets, what does it mean? What else appeared in the Fed's balance sheet on the asset side during this period? The dark segment just above the traditional securities holdings represents assets acquired or loans made during the crisis period. You can see that in late 2008, our loans outstanding to financial institutions and to some other programs rose very sharply, but you can also see that as time passed, certainly by early 2010, those initiatives to address financial strength had been greatly reduced. If you look at the far right, you see a little bump recently that is the currency swaps. We instituted and extended swap agreements with the European Central Bank and other major central banks, and there has been some uses of that in an attempt to try to reduce strains in Europe, in an attempt to some uses of that in an attempt to, 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 in an attempt to try to reduce restraints in Europe. And that shows up as a little bump there at the far right of the graph. At the far right of the graph. Now, again, we owned about $800 billion in treasury securities at the beginning of the crisis, but as you can see from the large area labeled LSEVs, we added about $2 trillion in new securities to the balance sheet during the period starting in early 2009. And then at the top, you have other assets, a variety of things, security reserves, physical assets, and other miscellaneous items. Why were we buying these securities? This is, by the way, an approach that monetarists such as Milton Friedman and others have talked about. The basic idea is that when you buy treasuries or government sponsored enterprises securities and bring them onto the balance sheet, that reduces the available supply of those securities in the market. Investors want to hold those securities and they have to sell for a lower yield or higher price. Or put another way, if there is a smaller available supply of those securities in the market, investors are willing to pay a higher price for those securities, which is the inverse of the yield. So by purchasing treasury securities, bringing them onto our balance sheet, reducing the available supply of those treasuries, we effectively lowered the interest rate of long-term treasuries and the GSE securities as well. Moreover, to the extent that investors no longer having available treasuries and GSE securities to hold in their portfolios, to the extent that they are induced to move to other kinds of securities, preferred habitat theory. So, such as corporate bonds that also raises the prices and lowers the yield on those securities. Prefer the habitat theory, but in terms of risks, not terms. Right, and so the net effect of these actions was to lower yields across a range of securities, and as usual, lower interest rates have supportive, stimulative effects on the economy. So this was really monetary policy by another name. Instead of focusing on the short-term rate, we were focusing on longer-term rates, but the basic logic of lowering rates to stimulate the economy is really the same. Huh. Lower yields across a range of security.